Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the powders that make the cartridges that you'll build at your hand loading bench, how they perform effectively and efficiently and safely. Now, we're very fortunate in this country that we have right now, at my last count, 106 different individual powders to choose from. We don't have a problem anymore with having powders that fit a particular need as it was in years past. There were cartridges in years past that simply would not perform up to their potential simply because there were no powders available at the time, except to the individual manufacturers. For instance, Winchester could have been producing a cartridge with their canister powders that were not available to the hand loader, that could propel certain cartridges at their factory velocities that were not attainable by the hand loader. So now that's all been resolved. Hand loading has become a very competitive industry, and now the manufacturers have all gotten on the bandwagon. Where it was once typically shunned by the various manufacturers, hand loading is now mainstream. So at one point, most cartridge manufacturers believed that any hand loading of components that they might provide was a liability to them. Now, in these days, even though we have greater liability concerns, and there are more lawyers out there than ever looking to sue, the manufacturers are now very willing to produce components that they put out on the marketplace, out on the shelves of the stores, so that people can make their own hand loads. And they're willingly providing us with a great variety of powders. Powders, those 106 powders fall within what's called a burning rate chart. It's like the periodic chart of elements, you might say. Starting with burning rate number 1, going all the way up to the last burning rate, whatever it is, that defines the quickness, the relative quickness of each individual powder. Now there's a great overlapping of powders, so that's why it's really inconsequential if you happen to develop a particular load, say for a 45 using Winchester 231 ball powder, and you run out of it and the store doesn't have it, you don't have to be concerned, because there are any number of powders that can work within, if not that specific burning rate, can work within a burning rate which is adjacent to it, that will perform admirably and perhaps even better, at least as well. Pay no attention, again, don't pay attention to anything that you see online. Don't follow the threads and worry about whatever people recommend for particular powders for particular cartridges. It's as simple as that. There is no magic powder, and there's no magic charge weight, and there's no magic anything with regard to cartridges. There are so many variables in any given rifle that I have, and in any given handgun that I have. I can produce the same wonderful groups, and I can produce also the same terrible accuracy. It goes throughout the range of different powders. Now, what about this relative quickness? Well, if you have, I'll turn to a burning rate chart here so you can see. You can, by the way, download PDF files from the internet on burning rate charts. They're widely available. Now, some of them will be brand specific. So a burning rate chart that you download from Hodgdon may only list the powders which they market, they also market the IMR series of powders and the Winchester, what used to be previously Olin. So they'll have other powders without the Hodgdon name on their burning rate chart, but other companies, Vitivori, may only produce a powder burning rate chart specific to their company, and so forth. So if you want to get a broad powder burning rate chart, you can go, for instance, to this page in the Lee manual, which you can see this This is the full 106 different powders which are currently being offered on the market in this country. This book is only a couple of years old, so this is the latest. This is the latest and the greatest as far as I'm aware. I haven't found any. I haven't found any vacancies. But the range of powder burning rates go all the way from number 1, which is Nitro 100, accurate, made by the Accurate Powder Company. Accurate Nitro 100 is number 1 position, and in position number 67, it's occupied by 2 powders which are used by the Browning machine gun cartridge, which is H50 BMG and HO US 869. So you can, and everything in between. And going up the burning rate chart, you're going to first of all have the quickest burning powders, which are used by handguns and pistols, and then you move into the shotgun powders, and then you move gradually into the rifle powders, which become slower and slower burning as they move up the chart. There is a significant overlapping of families too. For instance, many of the slower burning or medium burning pistol powders are also very usable with certain shotgun cartridges. So they share certain burning rates. A person, for instance, who shoots trap and skeet with Red Dot, made by Alliant, which Alliant used to be Hercules. That was the old Hercules company. If anybody wants to know where that company went to, that was a very old company in this country up until a few years ago, until it became Alliant. But if anybody were to shoot Red Dot powder in their shotgun for trap and skeet, they could just as well use Red Dot in their 44 special handgun for target loads. And so there it goes. And there's also, for the people who like to shoot unique in their handgun because it's accurate, they can shoot unique also in certain shotgun loads, and they can also shoot it in certain rifle loads, which is specified, by the way. You don't just jump to conclusions and say, well, I can use, GunBlue's says you can use unique for pistols, rifles, and shotguns, and then just start loading it up. It doesn't work that way. Everything has to be verified by published literature. If it's not verified by published, recognized sources, don't use it, and don't take anybody's word for it. Period. That's as simple as that. As I said again, I'm not going to give load data. I'm not going to give load recommendations or anything of the sort. I can certainly recommend that certain powders are viable for use in certain cartridges, but even then, if I happen to misspeak and it doesn't show up in a published listing, take the published listing for granted and not me. So anyway, the way this works essentially is that each family of powders, whether they're very, very fast burning powders, medium fast burning pistol powders, slow burning pistol powders, and so forth up the range, every family of powders is manufactured by each of the various manufacturers out there. They all are in the game. They're all making their wares available to anybody who is willing to buy them. And it's a great competition. So there's no one given powder that has that occupies a particular niche that nobody else has. I want you to understand one thing. When you look at a powder burning rate chart, it always comes with a caveat that powder burning rates can change under certain conditions of pressure and resistance, and with regard to different cartridges and different circumstances. So positions can shift up and down. One powder may become significantly slower or significantly faster under certain circumstances, and that can affect the way it's used in a particular cartridge. Those are factors which are discovered during the testing of powders and cartridges, in laboratories such as the ones that each of the bullet manufacturers has. They all have shooting ranges. They all have their own laboratories with their own test equipment and things like that that they measure pressures. Everything is very well controlled. So these are all things that they establish and they verify through their own testing. So even though you might have even though there are 3 powders that occupy position number 9, which is accurate number 2, red dot, and tight group, don't assume that you can simply exchange charge weights from one to the other. It does not work that way. Just because one load might say 5.2 grains of red dot does not mean that you can immediately substitute 5.2 grains of accurate number 2 or 5.2 grains of tight group. It doesn't work that way. Each powder has its own peculiarities under certain circumstances. So you always adhere to published loading data. So why do we have a powder burning rate chart? Well, it gives you a clue. It gives you a clue to what to look for. For instance, recently I ran out of a particular powder that I was using in my 45 ACP. This was back when a lot of powders were becoming scarce and difficult to find on the market. The shelves were drying up. But I was using a particular powder with my 45 ACP. My supply had run low, but I did have a large supply of a particular shotgun powder which was not listed in any of the manuals. So all I had to do was simply pick up the phone, and I called the powder manufacturer. I called Alliant, and I said, now I don't see this particular powder listed, the shotgun powder listed as a pistol cartridge load. Can you help me out? And about 3.5 hours later, I got an email from their technician, and he gave me exactly the different loads that were usable. And this is published data. It came right from their own sources. So it came right from their laboratory. So the technician wrote me back, and he told me exactly what the charge parameters were for the shotgun powder that I used, which was being made by them, to substitute for my pistol. And as a matter of fact, it turned out to be more accurate than the pistol powder I was using made by them. So maybe they learned something by it in the process. But a lot of it has to do with marketing, remember. Sometimes manufacturers of powder find it is suitable to market certain powders and just simply put on the bottle pistol powder or shotgun powder or rifle powder, even though there may be some sort of an overlapping component to them, even though they may be usable in other cartridges, in other platforms. So this powder burning rate chart can give you a clue to some of that, so that you can at least have maybe some wisdom about it. There's and it also gives you an at-a-glance understanding of where powders fall within a family of burning rates. The way a powder uses burning rate is this way. Quicker burning powders can be used in bores of lower resistance. It's as simple as that. So as the resistance goes down, then the quickness of the powder can increase. And as the resistance goes up, basically the longer, slower burning powders become more efficient. All of your rifle cartridges essentially occupy, I would say, the top 2/3 of all the powders which are currently being made. So in other words, if of all these powders right here, there's 3 columns, and it's actually probably almost the top half of all the powders for rifles. So as I begin to get up to H4198, up to powder burning range number 30, which is out of 67, and you've got to remember that the top 2 are occupied by the BMG, which is that's a powder of its own. That's in a class by itself. So really the top half of all the powders are relegated to the various rifles. Now there's a very, very broad range of burning rates within each family. The handgun that will shoot the very quickest burning powders may not handle the slowest burning powders at all, and vice versa. Because there's the differences in requirements. Large capacity cases should be filled up more than with slower burning powders than small capacity cases, which basically can use the quicker burning powders. Just as an example, if you were to take a paper towel tube and cut it to the same length as a soda straw, and fill your lungs up with air and blow as hard as you can through the cardboard, the large cardboard paper towel tube. There's no resistance whatsoever. Put a ball of, wad up a ball of soft paper and put it in there, and tissue paper, and blow that out. You'll find there's very, very little resistance, and the ball will emit from the other end. Likewise, take the soda straw, which has probably about a little less than a quarter bore, probably less than a 25 caliber soda straw. Put a small piece of balled up tissue paper in it, and fill your lungs up with air, and use the same effort to blow out through that tube. It's not going to blow out through the tube. It's going to blow out through the side of your lips, and that's what happens with a gun. That's what happens with a gun. It blows the receiver up. Because you basically, that small tube simply will not, even though the bullet itself, even though that little balled up piece of paper weighs significantly less than the large ball of paper, the resistance of that tube was so great that it simply would not accept all the air from your lungs to go down that tube at once. So as a result, it has to go someplace. It basically blows out the side of your mouth. So this is exactly the same sort of thing that I'm talking about. And if you increased the resistance inside the larger tube, the resistance goes up at a slower rate than if you increase the resistance in the smaller tube. That's just the way it works. It becomes much more difficult to blow two small pea-sized pieces of paper out of a soda straw. It comes exponentially more difficult than blowing one out, while at the same time there's barely a discernible difference between blowing out two large balls of tissue paper out of the large tube versus one. You see, there's a direct relationship of volume and resistance. So as the resistance increases, and as the bearing surface along the shank of the bullet increases, then slower powders basically become needed in order to gradually increase the velocity of the cartridge. It cannot be just kicked out. In other words, the bullseye powder, it's in the very quick burning range. I think it's in the top. It's in the top 4 or 5 or something. Let me see. Bullseye occupies position number 6. It was at one time, I think, the fastest burning powder on the market. Right now it occupies position number 6. There are actually faster powders. But bullseye powder is very efficient at knocking relatively low resistance bullets out of low resistance barrels. So for instance, it's a wonderful powder to use with short squat bullets such as the 45 ACP, 38 Special, and things like that, where you're launching bullets with a relatively large bore diameter and a relatively short bearing surface. They're especially efficient at that. Being quick burning, it means that barrel length has less effect on velocity. Barrel length is a large component in slower burning powders. You cannot get 264 Winchester performance out of a 22-inch barrel. You're going to get something much less than that. You're just going to be burning an awful lot of powder, and you're not going to be getting 264 Winchester performance unless you have a 24 or usually a 26-inch or even longer barrel. That's one of the reasons why it fell out of favor in the 70s, just a few years after it came out, because guys got frankly a little bit tired of lugging around 26-inch tubes on a very heavy gun. Even though it had light recoil, was one of its advantages. Well, it had light recoil, but you know, you had to carry around this huge stovepipe all day long out in a warm prairie. So efficiency with Magnum cartridges is directly tied to barrel length in order to burn all that additional powder. When you're trying to burn more than the standard bore, then it requires additional something. You have to give it time to burn. That's basically what it amounts to. The pressure curve builds very quickly with quick burning powders, and it builds more and more longer, slower, and with a need for greater barrel length as the burning rates go up. So I've always found that it's best to try to stick within the parameters that are generally accepted within certain cartridges. A 30-06 is a standard bore. Most standard bores will fire standard, medium burning rate powders. That's why IMR 4895, which was developed for military cartridges, was expressly for the 30-06. That's why that was such a popular powder for most standard bore cartridges, and it continues to be a very accurate powder with many cartridges to this day that are standard bore, because when I say standard bore, in other words, the powder burning chamber, the cartridge case, has that standard medium relationship of cartridge case capacity to bore capacity. So it doesn't need to have a huge long barrel. Such powders generally burn quite well within 22 inches, and in some cases they can still do quite well with very little velocity loss, even if you knock 4 inches off the barrel. But you see, as the need for slower burning powders increases, as the bore diameter decreases and the relative cartridge case capacity increases in relation to it, that can occur with the same size cartridge, remember. But as that relationship changes, then the burning rates generally get slower and slower and slower. The easiest example would be the 30-06 case. This occurs throughout all the different cartridges. But if you take a 30-06 case with a 30 caliber bore, and you increase it to 35 caliber and make it a 35 Whelen, the efficiency of that cartridge goes right up. It becomes much more efficient because the bore diameter has gotten larger. Think back to that paper towel tube. There's less resistance, and therefore you can drive larger bullets, considerably heavier bullets at very high velocities with little effort, and it still uses standard burning powders and maybe even a little bit quicker burning powders to get the job done. And for the guy who wants to carry around a very efficient gun, with a short barrel length and still get very, very good performance on heavy game, there's a good cartridge. As you go down to the 30-06, you're in the standard bore diameter. Then as you go down to the next jump down is into 28 caliber, in the 280. Now the 280 constricts it even more. So now the burning, instead of being in the range of IMR 4064 powder, or there's another one that's very common, 4350. Now the powder burning rate starts to lengthen, and you start getting into 4350 to IMR 4831. You start going up the scale a little bit, and when you get down to 270, you really have to have the slower burning powders if you want to get 270 performance. You can really constrict it and go to 25 caliber with your 2506. So, but each time, if you look at the charts in the books, you'll find that as the bore diameter decreases, the relative quickness of powder decreases. So you become slower burning powders as the bore diameter decreases. The cross-sectional area of a barrel has much to do with its efficiency. That's why when the 30-30 was increased to 32 caliber by Winchester to make the 32 Winchester Special, the velocity went up. It went, even though the bore diameter increased, the velocity went up, so it became more efficient, even though it was using roughly the same powder charges. So, and actually, because the resistance also went down, it meant that you can add a little bit more powder. So you actually not only do you get an automatic increase in velocity for the same amount of powder, you can actually add more powder to the case because it has a larger cross-sectional area in the barrel. So everything is directly tied to the resistance of the bullet or the shot column in a shotgun, whatever it is. So having an understanding of how this works will give you a huge leg up when it comes to picking out a rifle cartridge, a suitable rifle cartridge. A person who understands how this resistance factor works also understands that it's directly tied to the longevity of a barrel. The person who has a standard bore capacity will have a barrel that will last virtually forever, as long as it's not overshot, as long as it's not cooked by shooting too much at any short period of time. But the person who is really constricting their bore and is forcing those same hot gases to be more and more concentrated down the throat of the bore, that person is not looking at longevity. That person is basically looking at a barrel, the barrel's number of shots, because that barrel has a defined lifetime, and that can be significantly short with certain cartridges. The best way to describe this is that if you look at a welder who uses an oxyacetylene torch, you know, when he has the flames playing in a very narrow pencil shape, very small diameter pencil shape, and with great force, that's when he's got the greatest heat, and that's exactly what a small diameter bore does to a barrel. It's basically concentrating that same heat, and you know, all powder works by developing heat. That's how smokeless powder works. It develops heat, the heat expands, and it expands at such a rate and at such heat extremes that it throws the bullet forward. It develops pressure in all directions, but the only place that it can go is out forward behind the bullet. So, you know, heat is always involved. And whenever you have hot gases that are being concentrated down the bore, the more you concentrate them, the more effective they become at cutting into the steel. The heat that's generated inside of a cartridge case at the instant of firing is greatly in excess of the heat that's necessary to melt steel. Okay, I'll say that again. The heat that's generated inside of a cartridge case is greatly in excess of the heat that's necessary to melt steel. But the steel of a barrel will not, it doesn't just immediately turn into molten mass. If you're a person who sweats pipes, you know, for a living, if you're a plumber, if you've ever you know, sweat a pipe joint, you understand this. If you take the flame of a hot torch and you play it on a pipe that has even the slightest amount of water in it, it doesn't make any difference how many days you have to work on it. That joint will not come apart. That solder will never turn into a molten substance that you can release the joint. It's just not going to happen, because the water in the pipe combined with the rest of the pipe in the house acts as a heat sink and draws the heat away immediately. And that's what happens with a rifle barrel. The mass of the steel, the barrel itself, absorbs the heat, and the more steel there is, and the more surface area there is, the more quickly it dissipates heat. So there are different factors that act either to benefit this process or to act to its detriment. So if you have a large bore, if you have that 35 Whelen, which is shooting a large cross-sectional area bullet, the outside of the barrel has to be quite large in order to accommodate a 35 caliber bore, but also the 35 caliber bore itself is quite large and thus has a lot of surface area. It has considerably more surface area than, you know, if you're a mathematician, you want to work on surface area of a square inch and stuff, you know, have a blast. But you'll readily see that the surface area of a 35 caliber bore is significantly more per inch of barrel length than it is with a 30 caliber bore, and thus it goes down the scale as you go to 28 and then 270 and then 25. So all these things play into how much ventilation there is, how much cooling surface area there is in a barrel, and it also can be affected by outside barrel factors. Fluted barrels, they're not stronger. They're absolutely, that's a myth. Fluted barrels, there's less mass. They cannot be stiffer simply because you're not putting I-beams on them. You're cutting steel out of them. That's not creating I-beams, and that's a myth. But what they do is they do greatly increase surface area because each of those flutes adds more surface area to the steel. So there is a certain benefit to that, and they can also add the benefit of making the barrel somewhat lighter, even though at the cost of reducing its stiffness for that same diameter. But that's another side issue. But if you understand how powders work, and you understand how bore diameters in relation to powders work, you'll understand that why it's important to stick. If you want to have a gun that'll last a long time, try to stick to the family of standard bore diameters. And if you're moving away from that standard, if you're moving into Magnum cartridges, or if you're moving into less efficient cartridges that have smaller bore diameters for a given charge, then you got to slow down your rate of shooting and expect a shorter barrel life. I've burned out 270s. I have not burned out 30-06s. I've burned out 22 250s, but I have not burned out 222s. It's just the way it goes, and there's nothing you can do about that. Anybody who does any amount of shooting will certainly tell you that. Most of the 223s that are sitting at the stores that have been shot with high capacity magazines, you can probably expect that the first thing you need to do with those, if you buy them, is you got to put a new barrel on them, because those barrels are toast for the most part. Now, let's see where we go with this now. How is it that powders can be most effectively charged in a case? There's a great misconception that has been it's been basically fed by the commercial people who want to make money at it. Remember, I told you that a little while ago, not very long ago, hand loaders were shunned. They had a place in the corner of the store where nobody went, and there were a few components, and nobody paid attention to you. Now you're a big deal. Now everybody is cooking out new gadgets every other week, coming up with something to sell you more and more and more, because you're a big market. Everybody who's hand loading now, and everybody who wants to get into it, everybody who's watching this is part of that market. It's a fabulously growing industry, and they're taking note. And one of the things that they're feeding people is the notion, and it certainly sounds viable, is the notion that accurate powder charges are necessary. Well, to a point. If you're working up, I'll work on this from one end, and you'll see how it comes out at the other. If you're working up incremental loads, or the so-called ladder tests, if you're working up incremental loads, which I recommend for any person who's working up powder charges for a particular cartridge, the general rule is you start with 10% less than the specified maximum charge. So for instance, if a specified, I'm reading out of the book now, this is coming directly out of the book, If I were loading, for instance, a 125 grain jacketed soft point bullet that's specified by this Lyman number 49 book, a maximum load of IMR 4320, which is, by the way, that's a nice powder, good consistent powder. The maximum charge weight is 55 grains. Well, 55 grains, 10% less than that is 5.5 grains. So basically you start with 5.5 grains less than the full maximum, but never to be less than the lowest listing in the book. Okay, never. You don't. If the 10% is greater than the lowest listing in the book, don't go there. Never go below the lowest listing in the book, because powder works within a safe parameter, both min and max, minimum and maximum. Now there are certain powders that maybe they didn't test some of the ones that go below this, but don't presume that. Some powders act erratically when they get below certain pressure levels. When they are down below certain pressure levels, all of a sudden they start acting erratically, or they start sputtering inside the case and they get incomplete burning. You'll get a bullet lodged in the barrel, and the next one you fire on top of it, you got an obstructed bore and you got a catastrophe. Or you have a hang fire. Hang fire is that's a bad situation. To have a hang fire in a 44 Magnum that doesn't want to go, and all of a sudden, boom! That's a scary proposition. I've seen 45 long Colt loads that have had hang fires. I've seen 45 long Colt loads that literally lodged a bullet 3 inches down the bore, and it was all from the primer. There was not a bit of the powder had ever burned. So that creates a real problem. Now you got a bullet that's lodged in the bore that you have to drive out, and you got powder all over the place. If that sort of thing happens with a 460 Weatherby Magnum, I mean, you got hell to pay, because now you've got a cannon that is barely a gun that you can handle under the best of circumstances, let alone one that you don't know when it's going to come back and knock you in the head. So you really want to make sure that you stick within the book at all times. So, but to go again, you start out with 10% below the maximum charge listed. So it's always easy to figure it out. Just move the decimal point 1 point to the left. So if you're starting out with a 60 grain 3006 load, you just simply drop down 6 grains. That's it. Now, what's the increment that you work up by? That's the next question. Move the decimal point over just another point. So now, instead of 6 grains, you move to 6/10 of a grain. That's all there is to it. And so this works without any shuffling about with all your different cartridges. So you don't have to worry about it. If you're working with a 222 that uses 20 grains of roughly 20 grains of powder, you simply drop back 2 grains and you work up 2/10 of a grain each time. If you're working with a 50 grain cartridge, you drop back 5 grains and you work up a half a grain, 5/10 of a grain each time. And if you're working with a 30 grain cartridge, you drop back 3 grains and you work up 3/10 of a grain each time. Don't assume that because you've zeroed in on a load that works fabulously, because you zeroed in at 3/10 of a grain, that now you can like fine tune a little extra by working 1/10 of a grain on both sides of it. It's probably not going to, in my experience, it won't get you anywhere. Barrel harmonics are not that sensitive, and they don't have that much of a, there's no fastidiousness that gets to that level. Generally speaking, if whatever the 1% differentiation that you've discovered is the one that's going to work. Remember that the maximum load listed is what the manufacturer says is the maximum load listed. So you're working from a known high point, And so everything with all cartridges is relative to that. It's always working from the known high point of the pressure limit and then working back 10% from that and then working up 1% at a time. So you're always working with the same situation no matter what the cartridge is, whether you're working with a 45 ACP that only uses 5 grains of powder, or whether you're working with, you know, a 3006 that uses 60 grains of powder. The same rules apply. Go back 10, work up by a tenth. That's all you need to do. Now, this brings you to the next question is, do you always weigh charges from that point on? No, it's absolutely unnecessary. You can send me all the thumbs down you want, but I've been doing this all my life, and I know I can tell you, you don't have to weigh all your charges for the rest of your life, and you don't have to buy a $300 or $400 machine that trickles out charges to the exact tenth of a grain to get accurate loads either. It doesn't work that way. If you have a if you have a incremental load test going on, you always use your scale. You always use your digital scale or your balance beam if you have one. If you don't have one, you don't need to worry about it. You just simply use a dipper and use the loads that are recommended by Lee or whatever. But if you're working up an incremental scale, use the powder scale or use the balance beam and work up your loads with that precision that I just described to you. That way, there you know that you're working within a certain finite limit, and you're not blurring things. And also, it reduces the number of variables, because you get so many variables going on that compete against the accuracy game that it's, you know, this is always the issue. You make sure you go out on a calm day when the wind's not blowing, when you got good bright sunlight so you can see your target clearly, and all these things. And if it is windy, make sure that the wind is at your back or in your face, because anytime you have wind side to side, it's going to destroy all your testing. But if you're doing incremental loads, work them up with the degree of precision that I just outlined. Do only 4 rounds at a time. You know, in all my years, I found that 5 gets you no more accuracy. 3 can sometimes be deceiving, because you know you can easily get a cluster of 3 shots in a nice small hole, but that might be deceptive. It might be just happenstance, and that might conflict with the actual results that you might have gotten if you fired 4 shots. Four shots is more conclusive. If you have 4 shots and 1 is outside the group, and you have 3 close together, that's one I wouldn't let that get away, because that 1 shot that went outside is a flyer. If you have 2 shots that are in a close group and you have 1 shot outside, you don't know if that's a flyer or if that's actually the way that powder charge is going to work. And by the way, rifles and pistols fire groups. Shotguns fire patterns. I'm trying to pass along a tradition here. Stop using, if you're watching these threads, tell people stop calling rifle and pistol groups patterns. And we don't fire patterns with rifles. Annie Oakley fired patterns. She could draw, you know, she could draw pictures. That's a pattern. But we don't shoot patterns with rifles and pistols. That's what pellets do when they just hit stray groups. So anyway, as you're working up those loads, you work them up with the precision that I described. Once you've arrived at that precision, once you've arrived at the knowledge that your 257 Roberts or your 2506 or whatever it is happens to shoot with a particular load, then write it down in the book, and then from that point on, pull out your powder measure or your powder dipper, and then just simply charge them that way. That's all you need to do. You never need to use your scale again except to verify your powder measure, to set your powder measure up. If you're going to be doing a block of 20 or 50 or 60 rounds, you don't want to weigh each one individually. And that's not to suggest that you need to go out and spend a lot of money to get a machine that does it for you, that weighs them out for you. This powder dipper right here, and I've tested it. This is a simple Lee powder dipper. I tested it over and over again. In fact, I tested it just today, just an hour ago. Use the way that it's described in the book, and that's by lowering it into a reservoir of powder. In fact, if you just, all you need to do is take a coffee cup, a shallow coffee cup, or a Glad tub. Just lower it into the powder and let the powder flow into it and fill it up like it's filling up with water. Don't scoop it, because scooping compacts certain powders, but just let it fill up and then bring it straight out. You can just shake it off and you'll see it flatten out. That's sufficient. If you really want to have ultra precision, take a business card and flick it off. That's all you need to do. And when you pour that in, you're going to have that powder measure right there is 2.8 cc's. That's the amount of powder which is used for. That's the amount of powder which is used for a 243 Winchester, or say a 257 Roberts. So those two cartridges, that powder dipper will provide less than the maximum charge. They don't give you a powder dipper that gets you near maximum charges where you could accidentally go overboard. Even if I heaped that up, it would not go over maximum, so there's a safety margin built in. But that will charge to within 3/10 of a grain of my specified goal weight for a cartridge which holds roughly 28 to 30 grains of powder. So you're within that 1/10 of a grain limitation, and that's for precision. That's for precision. So, this is not the most precise way of measuring powder. Powder measures that click up and down, or maybe have discs with holes in them that slide back and forth in different types of systems. Those are more precise because there's an absolute volume that they occupy, and there's no variation with the way you strike them off at the top or shake them off at the top. So they're more precise in that way. So if I can get within 3/10 of a grain with this hand dipper, that's all that's sufficient for accuracy. And you don't have to worry about trickling out charges to come out to within a 1/2 of a grain or even 1/10 of a grain. The only cartridge that's only going to be measured that precisely, you'd have to have a 10 grain cartridge that had an error factor of over 1/10 of a grain. Well, to be very honest with you, if you have any situation like that, you're using a powder measure. Nobody that I know weighs out two and a half grains of powder. Nobody I know weighs out 2.5 grains of bullseye powder for their 38 special. They just don't do it. It's something you, and I'm not giving a powder charge here. But that's not something that you do with a scale. You'd go nuts. If you have to shoot a 120 round match, you're not going to sit there at a powder scale and drizzle out one charge at a time. You simply measure them. You simply measure them. When I say measure, that's by volume rather than by weight. All of your cartridges that you buy on the market, every single one, it doesn't make any difference who they're made by, they're all done by volumetric measurement. And you know that there's an awful lot of accurate commercial ammunition out there. You can make your own accurate ammunition at home in the same way that they do, simply by measuring with volume. So, I'm gonna try to keep things not only simple for you, or save money. You don't need to spend extra money. The person who spends extra money to get to the range doesn't shoot any better. That's my, it's the same as the person who goes out and buys, certain golf clubs. They have to buy signature golf clubs by such a pro in order to shoot 18 holes and everything. Well, all the pros that I've ever met in my life, they could do it with tablespoons. it doesn't make any difference to them. You know, the effectiveness of the golfer is not affected by the club that he uses. Most of the time he's using a club that somebody has paid him to carry around as a commercial enterprise. But you know, my skill as a shooter does not depend on whether or not I weigh out my charges one at a time. It has nothing to do with that. So don't tie things together that don't need to be tied together. Safety is the last thing I want to talk about. Powder safety. When you're dealing with smokeless powder, you're dealing with something that's potentially extremely dangerous. These two canisters of powder right here, you know, at a quick glance, if I were consuming a martini, I might grab one for the other, and if I did so, I would blow my gun up and blow my head off. Or perhaps if my child was shooting, I'd blow his head off or her head off. You know, in the one case you've got a rifle powder, and in the other case you've got a very quick burning pistol powder. And if you put the quick burning pistol powder into this case, the case that's designed for this powder, that gun is history. That gun will disintegrate. Because you're talking about a very, very quick burning powder in this case, which is designed strictly for pistol, that's calibrated for. And in this one here, this is a rifle powder. If you put the rifle powder in the pistol case, you could have detonation. You could have a situation where the gun simply detonates because the powder rate is not suited for that capacity. One of the things that I do is I mark down, I dig out my powder burning rate chart, and you can see the 39 on there. I take and I write down the relative burning rate on the can of powder when I purchase it. So in this way here, this one here is burning rate number 7, and this one's burning rate number 39. And because they have that number on it, when I bring it over to the powder measure, I'm always conscious of this. Always, many manuals will tell you to do this, and I've always adhered to it. I look at the can and I say 231, burning rate number 7, and then I look at the book and I make sure it says Winchester 231, and I repeat it. I go back and forth twice to make sure that I get the right thing. This isn't like grabbing the wrong soup off the shelf and coming home with, you know, the wrong, whether you have salt-free soup or regular soup, and this is bad news if you do the wrong thing. So it's always, don't be drinking, don't be smoking, have a clear head. Don't do this when you're having an argument in the family, when you just got done, you know, having a heated argument. Don't come down to the loading bench and start loading to assuage your nerves and everything. This is not the thing to do. You know, go to confession or whatever, take a ride, but don't be coming downstairs loading. But read out the number aloud and read it off twice. That way there you say, oh, gee, I didn't mean to grab that powder. You know, that's the sort of thing you want to make the mistake at the bench and catch it before you make the mistake that goes all the way to the shooting bench. So compare the powders and compare them twice, read them out to yourself twice, and I suggest that you mark down the burning rate right on the can so you know. When you see numbers like 1, 3, 7, 10, you know that you're talking about pistol and shotgun powders, and if you see numbers that are up in this range here, number 39 and stuff, you know you're talking about rifle powders, and that's just the way it is. These things will make sense to you after a while, and you simply know. Keep your workbench clear of powder. Always have only one powder on the bench at a time. Keep the others aside. Keep them locked up. Keep them in a cabinet which can vent. If they ever catch fire, they need to blow and vent so they don't blow your house up. These canisters are designed to disintegrate, or the lids pop off or something. They'll relieve the pressure before they blow up like a cartridge. Because if this ever blew up like a cartridge, you can just imagine. This has got, just as a matter of note, there are 7,000 grains of powder in a pound. So you can calculate how many loads you'll get if you just simply take the number of the number of grains that are used in the cartridge case that you use and divide it into the 7,000, and you can see. So if you're using 25 grains of particular powder each time you load your 223, or if you're using 2.8 grades of a particular powder every time you load your 38 special, you can see the economy. And if you're loading 85 grains of powder with a Magnum cartridge out of a can of powder, you can see that you're not getting very good economy whatsoever. The BMG shooter, I think, is about 25 shots you get out of it. 20 to 25 shots you get out of a pound of powder. So it's, these are all things to keep, on the consciousness. But there's a need for keeping your bench clear of any other powders, so you never mix them up. At the end of a loading section, you either pour the powder directly back into the canister, or you leave the empty canister beside your powder measure. For instance, my Loadmaster, it's ready and set up that I can load tomorrow if I want to. So I leave my CFE 223 empty canister standing right behind the press, and that way there I know that the CFE 223 in that jug, and so if I want to return it back to the jug, I know which jug to return it to. And likewise, if I should, a couple of days later or a week later or whatever, if I should come down and say, gee, I don't know what I put in that thing. Maybe I take out my loading discs. Now I've got a half a pound of powder in that, and I don't know what it is, and I can't say for certain. They're not readily identified. Don't ever assume that you can identify powder by examining it visually. That's not possible. Some powders look very similar to the other, and they're entirely different burning rates. The other thing is to never, under any circumstances, take unmarked powder from anybody. I would never, frankly, take powder from anybody, no matter what it is, because unless it comes from a store, unless you really know somebody and you trust the person, in all ways. If my best friend told me, this is this powder, and he gives it to me, I would trust him. But from somebody that's other than my very best friend, I would not simply trust everybody to give me a pound of powder, knowing that and know that it's what he says it is, because any mistake in that regard is too costly to mention. The other thing about the loading bench is to keep all spilled powder off of it. Don't vacuum it up into one of these hand vacs, these battery operated hand vacs, or even your home vacuum system. Don't vacuum it up with that, because sparks are sometimes generated by those things, and you can end up really having a real serious problem. The thing will burst into flames, and if there's enough powder, you could simply explode the device. The best thing is to simply take a soft brush. Keep your counter, your surfaces clean, sweep it into a trash can, and then immediately dispose of the trash outdoors. And don't don't be throwing a cigarette butt into your trash afterwards, because it's going to end up with a conflagration. You're going to have some spilled powder from time to time. You take that for granted. It just happens. It may be a small amount, just one case at a time, but it builds up in time over a work surface. So every day, cleanliness is the way to go. Always keep things absolutely clean. And the other thing, even though it's not related to powder, you always, even if you don't have standing powder on the bench, and even though your bench appears to be clean and you haven't got any granules of powder on it, sweep it off regularly, because primer dust occurs. Primer dusting is very, very serious with regard to progressive presses. Progressive presses that are operating with that cyclic, that machinery, clunk, 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 those things generate vibration, and even though the primer manufacturers seek to minimize the dusting of primers by putting paper shields in them and lacquers and all these other things that they do to keep dusting down, dusting still occurs, and it's a very hazardous situation. Enough of that dust becomes an explosive. So keep all your workbench clean. The last thing you want to do is to be, you can have a cluttered desk at work, and all these other places can be cluttered, but you really need to keep your loading bench clutter free, because if you can't see what you're doing, you're gonna make some big mistakes, and it's gonna lead to problems. You don't want to be you don't want to be stuffing a 180 grain bullet in when the data call for a 150 grain bullet with that charge, because again, there goes your gun, there goes your teeth or your jaw. You don't want to do that. Those are all things that you want to make sure only have on your work surface the items that are specified in your book. You've turned to a page. You have a particular load. Make sure you read it out to yourself. Place those articles on the bench. Clear all other articles off the bench and keep them away, and you'll have no problem whatsoever. And verify all your bullet weights. Put them on a scale. Make sure if you're taking them right from a virgin box, you're fine. But if you for whatever reason, if you think that maybe you've mixed up some bullets, just throw it on a scale and see what the thing weighs. Make sure that it's 150 grains or 125 grains. Put your calipers on it. Make sure it's the right diameter. You don't want to be mixing up diameters because you're going to be collapsing cases, or things like that. So it's all a matter of being very, very particular and precise. You can't be too particular and too precise when it comes to loading rifle and pistol and shotgun loads. I know there's a lot of people out there who their whole life is just a matter of, well, I get by with, I know I'm not that fussy. Well, if you're really not that fussy, you have no business whatsoever reloading. You're creating a danger. If you don't care about yourself, you should care about your family member who might take that ammunition someday and shoot it, or you should care about the person who you'll be standing beside down at the sand pit or down at the range, shooting alongside you. So it's all about being very, very cautious with this stuff. You're the only safety involved. All right. Thank you, and God bless.